Jim Burk is easy to introduce because, well, he's a full professor at the Texas A&M University, and he is president of the Inter-University Seminar, but that all is not so important. Sorry. No, what is important is his work, and just a small taste of his work is this schema that's built all around the central notion of legitimacy. And in this small, I adapted it a little bit from the original. I took my liberty, but
notes.
Yes, but that's one calls it enhanced learning, I think. But in this small bit of theory, you can almost build a course around it, because if you look at the schema, you can easily put high legitimacy and successful claim to resources. You can put countries in there. Integrated would be United States, Israel would be integrated, and Switzerland would be integrated. If you would look at alienated, well, I would personally put Germany and the Netherlands in the same corner, because we don't have much claim for budget, and the legitimacy is only, well, it's so-so, you know. We're not so connected to society. Japan, and Ayal is here, I think, yeah? Japan would be in the profiting, because they get a lot of money from the government, but there is totally no connection with society. So it's very, so you can use this schema very much, and you can build a whole course around it. So that is just a taste of Jim Burk's work, and he's going to give as an appetizer introductory to the key concept of freedom. And well, I'm curious about what Jim is going to say about freedom, and there's a lot of interesting developments, I think. So Jim, I would like to invite you to take the stand here.
So I must begin by thanking Yago for inviting me here today to give a talk to you all. I'm curious to know what I'm going to have to say about freedom as well. It's a much talked about concept that people seem to have a lot to say about it. And so we have our work cut out for us. I'll read fast, that way you won't understand me so well, and Q&A will be easier to control. Alternatively, you will understand me, and I'll just beat feet out this ramp, and I'll be on the other side of the door. You can find me there hiding. Well, I'm going to talk a bit about presidential rhetoric on war and the justification of war. I'm certainly not the first person who had the idea of looking at presidential rhetoric and seeing what we might learn from it. Carl Sandburg wrote about presidential rhetoric a long time ago now. He wrote about Lincoln's race for a seat in Congress. He was running against a populist Methodist preacher, a fellow named Peter Cartwright, who I haven't heard much about ever since this meeting, but he was running against Lincoln at the time. Cartwright had spread rumors that Lincoln was an infidel, a charge that Lincoln could not afford politically to ignore. During this congressional race, Lincoln went to one of Cartwright's revival meetings. Cartwright asked those who hoped to go to heaven to stand, and a great many did. Then Cartwright asked those who hoped to go to hell to stand, and not so many stood up. He asked, I'm jumping ahead, that won't work. He noted that Lincoln remained seated during this religious poll taking, and at last Cartwright asked him, he said, "Mr. Lincoln, you have not expressed an interest in going either to heaven or to hell. May I inquire as where you do plan to go? Lincoln replied, well, I didn't come here with the idea of being singled out, but since you asked, I will reply with equal candor. I intend to go to Congress. Some years after this encounter between Cartwright and Lincoln, on April 2nd, 1917, but on a more serious matter, Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany. His reasons for doing so were carefully crafted. There was no animus against the German people, of whom a great many lived peaceably in the United States, nor was there animus against German institutions, many of which were widely admired by Americans and taken as a model to follow, especially in the arts and in higher education. Rather, the complaint was against the policies and belligerent practices of the German government. The government had proven itself to be a natural foe of liberty, and so to be an opponent and a threat to people living in democratic societies. Such a threat to freedom could not be ignored. Wilson declared, the whole force of the nation should be spent making the world safe for democracy, with peace planted upon tested foundations of political liberty. Force, he said, was justified to secure this freedom. American political leaders since Wilson have claimed the right to fight in defense of liberty. Consider just 3 examples. In 1950, shortly after North Korea's invasion of South Korea, Harry S. Truman called the invasion an attack on freedom. The American people, he said, were unified in their belief in democratic freedom, unified in detesting communist slavery. And while the cost of freedom was high, he said, we are determined to preserve our freedom no matter what the cost. In doing so, our country stands before the world as an example of how free men, under God, can build a community working together for the good of all. In 1964, Lyndon Baines Johnson sought a broad authorization from Congress, an authorization to pursue military operations against communist forces in, where was that? Southeast Asia. Forces that he claimed, Johnson claimed, forces that attacked the U.S. Navy ships without provocation in the Gulf of Tonkin. Johnson's purpose was to defend freedom against communism, a policy, he said, which had been followed at least since 1954. The conflict was not just a jungle war in an isolated place. It was a struggle for freedom on every front of human activity. And in response to his request, Congress wrote Johnson a virtual blank check to wage war in defense of liberty, to stem tyranny in Vietnam. More recently, in 1960, George Herbert Walker Bush pledged to overturn Iraq's invasion of Kuwait as part of an ongoing struggle for freedom. Bush said it was necessary to resist aggression. Otherwise, aggression will destroy our freedom. It was necessary to stand up for what's right and condemn what's wrong. The aim was to create a world where the rule of law supplants the rule of the jungle, a world in which nations, led by the United States, recognized a shared responsibility for freedom. Meeting responsibilities is never easy in a democratic society. There are bound to be differences among a free people. But Bush believed in times of adversity and challenge, Americans come together, They come together to meet and overcome threats to liberty. Well, these illustrations are just illustrations, of course, but they do support the plausibility of our commonplace belief that the defense of liberty justifies war. Their plausibility rests on a reasonable claim that liberty is opposed to tyranny. If liberty is lost, then tyranny takes its place, an outcome that defenders of tyranny would abhor. To prevent this abhorrence, defenders of liberty are justified in going to war. Securing the blessings of liberty is the end that justifies the means. This commonplace belief I will call by a more formal name, the Unitarian Rhetoric of Liberty. In its formal expression, this unitary rhetoric refers to a way of thinking about the world and thinking about values in the world, values that justify war when freedom is threatened. It is a monopolistic way of talk, as if it was the only legitimate voice in the defense of liberty. It is an either-or kind of talk. Its justification of war brooks no rivals. Its position is unambiguous. Wars are legitimate when they are fought for the defense of freedom. That's all there is to it. Well, that's all well and good, except the problem we find ourselves in is that this isn't the end to it. This is not the end to it. The problem is that besides a unitary rhetoric of freedom, there is also a pluralist rhetoric of freedom. The pluralist rhetoric of freedom holds that the defense of freedom encompasses the defense of many values, not one, and certainly not a simple opposition with tyranny. A pluralist rhetoric of liberty appeals to us because it accords with our empirical observations of a pluralist world. In pluralist talk about justifying war, there are various freedoms to consider: positive freedom and negative freedom, civil and political and social freedom, personal, sovereign, and civic freedom, and maybe more. Yago, seeing I'm parched halfway through, is providing me with water to make it work. Thank you, Yago. I'm making you thirsty just listening to this. Making me thirsty, too. Maybe I'll have a drink. I don't know whether you have one. Well, you know. Thank you, Yago. In pluralist talk about justifying, I'm pretending that I never stopped, right? In pluralist talk about justifying war, there are various freedoms to consider. These may be distinct, these may be partially overlapping, they might even be opposed to one another, or all three at the same time. The pluralist world is one that recognizes complexity and ambiguity, in which the justification of war may rest on thoughts about second and third order consequences. Now, both rhetorics generate reasonable justifications for war, which cannot be just dismissed. It's not easy to say that we should prefer the unitary over the pluralist rhetoric of liberty. Both have virtues and guide us reasonably on our foreign policy, but both are also subject to flaws. The perspective of the unitary rhetoric, when compared with the pluralist rhetoric, is that it's too narrow and limited. It has one thing to talk about, the opposition between freedom and tyranny, and nothing else to say about other values or a more pluralistic understanding or more varied understanding of the freedoms which we enjoy. Unitary talk is more likely than pluralist rhetoric to miss something. it looks at too few things. And if it misses something, then it provides us with wrong reasons, or it provides us with faulty justifications for going to war. This is what happened in the American decision to begin the war in Iraq in 2003. In contrast, the pluralist rhetoric of liberty increases the number of values affecting the justification of war, but it does so without any kind of barriers at all to say, well, it's this many factors we have to consider, but no more, or what exactly? What are the number of factors that need to be considered? This is not a cost-free world in which you can simply multiply variables to consider and get a better answer just by increasing the number of variables. That works in some disciplines, it doesn't work in ours. Without any clear boundaries, or where the multiplication of values increases, the ambiguity of meaning and the likelihood of misunderstanding also increases. As we increase the number of values, the ways we speak about freedom, we make it more and more difficult to understand exactly how these various values are fitted together, how they're resolved, how they're reconciled with one another. Indeed, under certain circumstances, pluralist talk about freedom may ironically justify the violation of freedom, the violation of human rights, as it did, I would argue, with the violation of human rights in the policy of torture. Now, to examine these points in greater depth, I want to compare two famous examples of American presidents who relied on the defense of freedom to justify the use of military force abroad. The first is the Four Freedoms speech by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, delivered before Congress on January 6, 1941, nearly 1 year before Pearl Harbor. At that time, the country was conflicted over whether it should enter another world war. The second address I want to speak about is George W. Bush's address to Congress that was delivered over 60 years later on September 20, 2001, just 9 days after the terrorist attack of September 11. Unlike Roosevelt's audience, which was uncertain about whether to enter war, Bush's audience was all too ready to believe that a global military response was needed to bring those responsible for September 11 to justice. Without doubt, the different historical context in which these speeches were written and delivered set unique tasks for each speech to accomplish. Nevertheless, both speeches shared a similar aim. The aim is to prepare the American public for a long and arduous war in defense of liberty. This common aim provides a basis for comparison and will in the end allow us to draw some conclusions about how the defense of freedom may affect democratic processes and prospects. Let's spend a little time talking about unitary rhetoric of liberty, and then we'll spend a little time talking about the pluralist rhetoric of liberty, and then I'll enter into some foreign territory having to do with political sacrifice and democratic processes. First, about unitary rhetoric. The unitary and political rhetorics of liberty offer alternative understandings of the ways in which liberty needs to be defended, or the two. Of the two, the unitary rhetoric has the deepest roots in American political culture, and it has the simplest understanding of how the defense of liberty justifies waging war. This rhetoric is founded on the belief that American culture and history are unique among all nations and uniquely called to provide a model that would benefit other nations to follow. This idea that America is somehow exceptional, this idea of American exceptionalism, dates back to the 17th century and continues to resonate even in the fragmented politics and culture of the 21st century. Interesting though American exceptionalism is, it's not our topic, it's not part of the requirements of our present task to dwell on. It's enough for us to grasp the central role that liberty played in the making of American identity. As John Winthrop preached in 1630, America is as a city upon the hill, and the eyes of all people are upon us. America was put here by divine plan to be sought out by those who were possessed of an abiding love of liberty and of a special kind of courage. This idea of American exceptionalism, with its not so implicit notions of we versus them and good versus evil, influenced both Franklin Roosevelt and George W. Bush when they sought, as many have done, to justify war in defense of freedom. They both hoped to persuade us that there was an unbridgeable gulf between the good of American freedom and the tyrannical forces of evil. They both believed those on the side of liberty would ultimately defeat tyranny because liberty was the more powerful of the two. Let's see how they argued. Roosevelt called the Axis powers the dictator nations. They were tyrants with whom one could not bargain. To bargain would yield neither liberty nor safety. Rather, he said, our policy must, this is Roosevelt, our policy must be to defeat the foreign peril, to establish the justice of morality, and to show respect for the liberties of all nations and their peoples. With adequate preparation and willingness to sacrifice, the side of liberty must and will win. The liberty he had in mind was summed up by the four essential human freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom to worship God, each in his own way, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. All four freedoms were to be secured when the fight against tyranny was won, not just in the United States, but also everywhere in the world. President Bush acknowledged that 9/11 was an unprecedented attack on the United States by al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was a fringe form of Islamic expressionism that aimed to remake the world by imposing its radical beliefs on people everywhere. They were haters of democratic processes and democratic traditions. They embraced no values except the will to power. They walked down the path previously trod by fascists, Nazis, and totalitarians. So, Bush said, the world had no choice between liberty and tyranny. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. Bush hoped the civilized world would rally to the American side. It was, after all, the world's fight, not just America's. It was civilization's fight, and the fight of all who believe in progress and pluralism, tolerance and freedom. It was necessary to stop terrorism, to eliminate it, and to destroy it where it grows. If the United States remains determined and strong, this will not be an age of terror. This will be an age of liberty, here and across the world. This is what George W. Bush sought. Now, these selected passages portray a unitary rhetoric of liberty. They pit liberty against tyranny. They believe that free societies are called on to defend liberties. They want to stand up for what is good, to fight and defeat tyranny. They tell a good story, but the story was not always complete. Presidents have used unitary rhetoric to justify war in Iraq, in Vietnam, or you pick your favorite war of choice. Presidents have used unitary rhetoric to justify war misleadingly. They withhold key evidence that might have led to a fuller and more complex policy debate about whether war was justified or not. Let's look at pluralist rhetoric. The pluralist rhetoric of freedom is less likely than the unitary outlook to overlook what are inconvenient truths. The pluralist rhetorics of freedom are not one, but many. They are as varied as the historical context from within which they arise. Consider Isaiah Berlin's famous essay on two concepts of liberty. Published originally in 1958, this essay compares two kinds of liberty, negative and positive. One is about freedom to act without being coerced, while the other is about freedom to be one's own master. Written during the Cold War, both positive and negative rhetorics were used, not surprisingly, to represent one side or the other of that bipolar conflict. As Berlin put it, the advocates of negative freedom wanted to curb authority as such. Advocates of positive freedom wanted authority placed in their own hands. On this account, negative freedom resonates with the politics of the West, while positive freedom, albeit in a corrupt form, resonates with the collective politics of the East. Reflecting on Berlin's essay, Judith Shklar noted that American talk about liberty was not only shaped by Cold War tensions, nor by the contrast between positive and negative freedom. In the United States, this contrast was shaped rather by the theory and practice of rights. Given the heritage of slavery, that's not so surprising in American society. What matters most in America is a person's natural right to defend himself effectively in a judicial court against all those who would deprive him of his full citizenship and of his constitutional rights. The point is that political experience forges the varied rhetorics of liberty and justifications for war in ways that Berlin may not have imagined as an Oxford Dawn. No one has written better than Orlando Patterson on the historical and plural rhetorics of freedom. In his book, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, Patterson tells how freedom arose as a value in Western history. He rejects Isaiah Berlin's assertion that personal or negative freedom is a modern creation. He argues instead that in all respects, our freedom, our modern conceptions of and intense commitment to freedom were established in the ancient world. For our purposes, the import of Patterson's book lies in its argument that freedom is not one idea, but three. The first freedom is personal. It's akin to Berlin's idea of negative liberty. It refers to the freedom to be left alone, not to be interfered with or coerced, but to pursue the goods one desires, so long as others may do the same. Its origins were found in movements against slavery, led to a considerable degree or a surprising degree by women, who of course were often enslaved. The second freedom is sovereignal. Sovereignal freedom refers to the ability to do what one pleases, no matter what the consequences for others. It is the liberty to lord it over others, the liberty to do whatever one pleases, insofar as one can. It is originally the freedom of warriors. It is the opposite of personal freedom. The third freedom is civic freedom. Civic freedom refers to the ability of citizens to participate in the rule of the society to which they belong. It is the liberty to have a say, a liberty as a citizen who has equal rights with others, and participate in a common management of their common life. The origin of civic liberty is found in the extension of citizenship offered as concessions by political and economic elites to secure the support from the lower classes. If Patterson's three-stranded account of freedom is correct, then it's hard to know which meaning of freedom leaders have in mind. In a presidential address, are we talking about personal freedom or sovereignal freedom? I would contend it matters very much which one we're referring to, and it's not always clear from foreign policy discourse exactly what liberty is meant. The possibilities are not one or two, but many. And so we find ourselves in an ironic situation, one in which we cannot be perfectly sure where meaning lies. Or worse, we can't be perfectly sure. We have to doubt whether we can know where meaning lies. This is a situation the United States found itself in during the Cold War, when it seemed necessary to build nuclear forces to deter the Soviet threat, knowing all the while that it would be insanity or self-defeating to employ those forces without limit. The irony may have been clearer to see during the Cold War, clearer to see than it is now that the Cold War has ended, but the situation, the objective situation, is not fundamentally different. The United States still maintains a huge military arsenal to defend freedom and to defeat collective violence, even though these goals are more difficult to attain, the more force is relied upon to attain them. Under these circumstances, it's hard to know what to do, hard to know what is meaningful to do. Adherents of pluralistic rhetoric are challenged to recognize and reconcile the varieties of values affecting the defense of liberty, and to justify waging war. In his Four Freedoms speech, Roosevelt met the challenge of pluralist rhetoric with remarkable clarity. This is evident from his analysis of the aims of his defense of liberty and what the defense of liberty should pursue. For Roosevelt, freedom means honoring the supremacy of human rights everywhere. The United States and all democracies at war should fight against tyranny at home and abroad. At home, the country should pay decent respect for the rights and dignity of all within our gates. And abroad, it should pay decent respect for the rights and dignity of all nations. The country should build a healthy, strong democracy. It should provide equal opportunities, no privileges for the few, security for those who need it, civil liberties for all, and a rising standard of living. Achieving these ends would build a foundation for the new world created after the war was won. Freedom of speech, freedom for worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. All this for everyone, everywhere in the world. A complex understanding of freedom, but one which we value for its coherence. Of course, reality failed to achieve all that was hoped for by Roosevelt. Yet what was hoped for set a standard for how a free society could be judged and why it was worth fighting for. If the performance was flawed, the expectation remained and remains for us. Roosevelt's speech exemplifies a pluralist rhetoric of liberty justifying war. The values sought are not dominantly militant. They are a collection of values, general and specific, that spell out in coherent fashion the various goods that are necessary for and enjoyed in a free society. In contrast, Bush's speech offers a negative example of the pluralist rhetoric of liberty. It is negative because it fails to justify war in freedom's defense or in defense of any other particular moral aim. It's not that no particular moral aims are mentioned or brought up for discussion. They are mentioned, but they're not couched in a particular way to persuade. The war on terror, Bush said, was the fight of all who believe in progress and pluralism, tolerance and freedom, for moral aims. The value of freedom is mentioned, but it's the only one of four values, and its relationship to the other three values is never brought up for discussion. We don't know whether their importance is greater or lesser than the importance of freedom, and if it is greater or lesser, why it's greater or lesser. This is simply not discussed. In short, Bush offers what appears to be an ad hoc list of aims that might justify war. A few paragraphs later, Bush asked Americans to uphold the values of America. These values, which he did not specify or name, seemed to be important. Bush said, "We are in a fight for our principles, and our first responsibility is to live by these principles." But the principles we were to live by were never spelt out. The audience was not told to single out, was told not to single out others for unfair treatment, or to say unkind things about others because of their ethnic background or religious faith. And to be sure, that's good advice, but it was weakly asserted, not strongly defended by George W. Bush. It was an opportunity lost not to explain the defense of freedom that justifies war. Clarity and strength were reserved for giving nations an ultimatum. The nations of the world would have to choose. Every nation in every region now has a decision to make, Bush said. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. It is either we or they, and presumably all on American terms, the only terms offered. Here, a version of freedom is prioritized, but if anything, it is Patterson's sovereign freedom, the freedom of one or one nation to lord it over people or peoples. It's the language of Alcibiades, given to the council at Milos. So what about political sacrifice and democratic prospects? The two speeches we've been reading differ radically, dramatically in their treatment of the need for political sacrifice when using force to defend freedom. Both address the issue, who must do what to fight the threat of freedom. But Roosevelt's For Freedom address deals more directly with the issue than does Bush's address. The difference is substantively important. Roosevelt accepts and Bush rejects the following theoretical claim. Ready? If you ask nothing from others to do what both you and they want done, then you are reserving for yourself the right to pursue this good however you may, without restraint by or accountability to others. I'll say it again. If you ask nothing from others to do what both you and they want done, then you are reserving for yourself the right to pursue this good however you may, without restraint or accountability by others. There's a corollary to this claim. The corollary is that political leaders who ask others in society to help them rule will enhance democratic prospects. Again, to repeat, the corollary is that political leaders who ask others in society to help them rule will enhance democratic prospects. Leaders who ask no one to help them rule diminish the prospects for democratic rule. The fundamental question of democracy is how exclusionary or inclusionary it is. Roosevelt's was clearly inclusionary. Bush's was not. Bush raised and answered the question, what is expected from citizens to help in the war on terror? He asked Americans for many things: to live their lives, to hug their children, to uphold the unnamed values of America, to support victims of the tragedy with cash contributions, to cooperate with the FBI, to be patient with delays and inconveniences over tighter security, a sore point for anybody who's been flying recently, and to retain their confidence in the American economy. Remarkable about this list is how small were the sacrifices citizens were asked to make. Citizens were asked to do little or nothing, not much more than they would have done before September 11. Citizens shared the goal of political leaders to eliminate the terrorist threat, but leaders must have believed that they did not need the citizens' help to pursue this threat, not even to pay more taxes. Also remarkable was that the president asked nothing of substance from Congress, except to thank members of Congress for what they had done and will do, which was vague enough. Much was asked specifically from the executive branch of government. Not the citizens, not the Congress, but the executive branch. It was asked, for example, to improve air safety, to give additional tools to law enforcement agencies, to strengthen the economy, and to rebuild New York City. All these were steps toward eliminating the terrorist threat. In this larger task, Bush, as president, made promises of his own as the executive power of the government. He said he would not forget this wound to the country. He says, "I will not yield, I will not desist, I will not relent in waging this struggle for freedom, a struggle whose outcome is certain because our cause is righteous, and between freedom and fear, certainty and cruelty, God is not neutral." Now these lists are these lists are important. These lists are important because they tell us which actors were mobilized to defend our freedom and which were relegated to the sidelines. Citizens and their representatives in Congress had no or only a small role to play. They were asked to do nothing much except to authorize the president what the president wanted done to prosecute the war on terror. The executive branch would do the real work with little consulting with others. It was subject to no named external restraints on its action and accountable to none for its acts, with the possible exception of God. We'll leave that for another day. Apparently, the war on terror was to be an autocratic affair, not to be interfered with by democratic processes and values, especially those values strengthening the systems of checks and balances on which democracy depends so much. Instead, democratic processes of congressional oversight and public debate atrophied under the regime of President Bush. Roosevelt's call for sacrifice was far more inclusive, more democratic than it was for Bush. After defining the unprecedented threat to freedom posed by dictator nations and defining the freedoms to be defended, Roosevelt turned his attention to the one great need at that moment, to increase armament production. This need could only be met by drawing on the cooperation of many. This collective enterprise was to be done by leaders of industry and unions, by the Army and the Navy, by those making airplanes and by those building warships. In every case, even where production was ahead of schedule, the objective was to achieve quicker and better results, so industry had to be further mobilized. To change a nation from a basis of peace production to a basis of wartime production, Roosevelt said, "This is no easy task." While the word sacrifice wasn't used at this point in the address, sacrifice was required under conditions where no one was satisfied with the progress made so far. Roosevelt said, "None of us will be satisfied, not until the job is done." To do that required all of us working day and night and working in a cooperative manner, moved by ability and patriotism. Congress was also needed. It had to keep itself informed at all times of the progress being made. It would have to authorize and provide funds sufficient to manufacture war supplies of many kinds. It would have to find creative ways to finance the cost of those supplies so that there would be no delays supplying democracies already at war, relying, of course, on military leaders to tell us what was needed by whom and when. Indeed, no one would be left out. We must all prepare, Roosevelt said, to make sacrifices that the emergency demands. He called for personal sacrifice. and expected all Americans would respond to that call, to include a willingness to pay more money in taxes. He believed voters would approve, putting patriotism ahead of pocketbooks. In this process, everyone had a role to play. Everyone was called on to make hard material sacrifices for what Roosevelt called the common good. This alone was a prod to democratic processes, but restraints and accountability were relied on where patriotism alone might not succeed. Production goals were set and monitored to ensure goals were met. Slackers were subject to the coercive control of government. No one was allowed to get rich from more production payments. In brief, mass mobilization only worked to the extent democratic processes in all sectors of society were held accountable to one another. In these paragraphs, Roosevelt is summoning civic liberty, the right to participate and have a say in the management of democratic way of life as a tool to secure civic freedom. No one was relegated to the sidelines because the sacrifice was real and the summoning of civic liberty was real, and the defense of freedom was not just a rhetorical device, it was real. Still, we cannot suppose that either the Unitary or the Pluralist rhetoric is invariably more persuasive than the other. Both ways of talk are valuable. Both are flawed. Unitary rhetoric reached unambiguous conclusions when Roosevelt and Bush defined threats to freedom. But ambiguous rhetoric was, it's hard to read a speech and sound like you're talking. Doing the best I can. Unitary rhetoric reached unambiguous conclusions when Roosevelt and Bush defined threats to freedom, but ambiguous rhetoric was bound to be misleading and incomplete, as was Bush's authorization to invade Iraq. Pluralist rhetoric, as Roosevelt showed, could provide a meaningful and nuanced account of the defense of freedom and the justification of war. Yet, as Bush found, when pluralist rhetoric becomes more complex, problems of meaning are difficult to reconcile and resolve. In sum, these two modes of rhetoric, unitary and pluralist, are not alternatives to choose between, as if we were choosing between heaven and hell. The choice we face is reformed by ever-changing historical contexts to which we must adapt by deliberating together, open to doubt. We can never be perfectly sure whether a defense of freedom justifies war, but we can engage in a self-correcting circle of discourse in which we can take out critics' claims. We take our critics' claims as seriously as we take our own, just as if we would do if we intended to go to Congress.
This is a nice position to be autocratic, of course, but I don't want to be autocratic, and I want to be inclusive, so I would like to invite the audience also to participate in the discussion and question and answer to Jim.
Do you think that this appeal to liberty and freedom is a distinctly American approach to war and war justification? Because as we see, rising powers in Beijing and an increasingly belligerent Moscow, they're at times alluding to these type of terms and rhetoric, but I'm not quite sure it has the same substance. So I was curious as to how kind of generalizable your observation is in terms of liberty as a justification for war.
What we're talking about is the topic of choosing to go to war. What are the conditions under which nations choose to go to war or choose not to? We don't know much about a lot that comes under this topic. We don't know much about choices governments make not to go to war. and why it is that they make those decisions. It's much easier to see when a nation has decided to go to war. So the topic is vast, and there's lots of unanswered questions here. What I've tried to do is lay out an analytic framework using the American example, because I know this is going to be difficult. And it's going to be difficult historically and analytically, theoretically. So I thought if I could keep one thing constant, and that would be the American culture, which I know something about, then I could develop my analytic framework, and then the next task would be precisely that, to see whether this is Jim and the American people talking to themselves, or whether we have something to say of some general significance. So it's very heartening to me that you're enlisting in the fight of deciding how it is we can have a general theory of choosing to go to war, which considers the values of freedom and democracy as central values. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? I have a question, Jim. May I?
Oh, please.
So, okay.
No skeletons.
Yeah, no skeletons. No, no Ahmeds. Well, I know. So, suppose that you meet Ahmed. He also has his point of liberty. So the liberty of the other side is also a rhetoric, no matter what political system. So sometimes they use the same rhetoric. They have a different notion of liberty. The Soviet Union had a kind of people's democratic notion of liberty. Adolf Hitler was also inclusive leader. He was not a nice man, but he was an inclusive leader. So what about the other side and their rhetoric?
Well, what is exactly the other side in this case?
If you are analyzing speeches of Roosevelt, and so the other side would be the other side.
Well, I mean, what I think we should do theoretically is to recognize what is true. Everybody's going to use some rhetoric, or they're not talking at all. Now, Yago mentioned at the beginning of our session the importance of distinguishing an emancipatory language and an instrumental language, and I think that definition is very useful. Everybody's going to use some rhetoric, so the question is, what rhetoric are they using, and how are they using it? And I think when we look at democratic societies, the framework that I've laid out is reasonable, but I confess I'm assuming as a background variable that we're talking about genuinely democratic societies here. And the debate between Roosevelt and his enemies in the 1940s and early 50s were conducted very differently than the debates in the Soviet Union under Uncle Joe. And about Uncle Al, well, we'll just leave that aside.